This is lecture 61C that accompanies the ABCs of Communism, Bolshevism 2018, Volume 4, Communism in Oceania, Chapter 64 on Melanesia, and specifically today we're talking about the Solomon Islands, and it has been 3/4 of a century since the fate of the world turned at Stalingrad on the Volga and Guadalcanal in the Solomons. This was the beginning of the end of Hitlerian fascism in the Western world, happening at exactly the same time as the beginning of the end of Japanese fascism in the Pacific world, the USSR and the USA being the winners in these two titanic struggles. 1942 was also the year I was born, so now that my lifetime work has taken me back to the Solomon Islands, as I write this fourth volume in the ABCs of Communism, Bolshevism 2018, it is on my mind. Anyway, the Solomon Islands are a complex collage of crustal units or terrains termed the Solomon Block that were formed and accreted within a post-Cretaceous intra-oceanic environment, that is, after the asteroid impact 65 plus million years ago. Two stages are of crustal growth developed from the Eocene onwards. That's the first geological phase after that impact. No, the second geological phase after that impact. The present-day highly oblique collision between the Pacific and Australian plates has resulted in the formation of rhombohedral intra-arc and back-arc basins. Today, the Solomon Islands consist of an extensive archipelago, specifically Choiseul Island, the Shortland Islands, the New Georgia Islands, Santa Isabel, the Russell Islands, the Florida Islands, Malaita, Guadalcanal, Secainana, Maramasike, Ulawa Uki Bakira, or San Cristobal, as it was called in those days, Guadalcanal days of the battle, Santa Ana, Redell, Bellona, and Santa Cruz Islands. The distance between the most western and most eastern islands is 930 miles. The Santa Cruz Islands, north of Vanuatu, are isolated at more than 120 miles from the other islands. Bougainville is geographically part of the Solomon Islands archipelago, but politically, as we have seen, is an autonomous region of Papua New Guinea. There are volcanoes on some of the larger islands, while many of the smaller islands are simply tiny atolls covered in sand and palm trees. The rainforests are a terrestrial ecoregion covering most of the Solomon Islands archipelago. Mangroves and coconut groves shelter the coastal strips, while the interiors of the high islands are swallowed by dense rainforest. The forest climbs through 24 belts, from towering lowland hardwoods to the mosses atop Guadalcanal's 2,300 meter peaks. It's about 9,000 feet. Now, where the forests have been destroyed by the slash and burn agriculture or logging, grasslands have taken hold. Crocodiles lurk in brackish mangrove swamps in the river deltas, and while sago palms grow in freshwater swamps, more than 230 varieties of orchids and other tropical flowers brighten the landscape. Of the 4,500 species of plants recorded so far, 143 were and are utilized in traditional herbal medicine. The endemic land mammals, rats, bats, and mice, are mostly nocturnal. The gray cuscus is the only marsupial found in the Solomon Islands. Bird life, on the other hand, is rich and varied, with about 223 species, including 16 species of white-eyes, fantails, rails, thrushes, and honeyeaters that occur only here. The most unusual is the Megacode, or Incubator bird. This is a bird that lays large eggs in the warm volcanic sands of the thermal area. After about 40 days, the newly hatched megapodes dig themselves out and are able to fly short distances as soon as their wings dry. A BBC series entitled The South Pacific, now showing on Netflix, provides the first photo essay details of this highly specialized bird species that can only grow in volcanic islands. There are many, actively volcanic islands. There are many species of colorful parrots and 130 species of butterflies, including several species of birdwings. The 70 species of reptiles include crocodiles, frogs, lizards, skinks, snakes, toads, and marine turtles. The 5 species of sea turtles nest from November to February, and several of the 20 species of snakes are poisonous, but fortunately they are not common and are no threat. Centipedes and scorpions are 2 other potentially dangerous jungle creatures, but are now seldom encountered, although they were constant threats to U.S. Marines and soldiers in the Battle for Guadalcanal in 1942. The isolated Santa Cruz group has fewer indigenous species than the main island chain. Each year, thousands of rare birds, reptiles, amphibians, aquarium fish, and butterflies are exported from the Solomons to be sold in Asia, North America, and Europe. Archaeology, environment, and linguistics. A part of Melanesia, these islands have been occupied for at least 30,000 years. The human history of Solomon Islands begins with the first Papuan settlement at least 30,000 years ago that came from New Guinea. They represented the furthest expansion of humans into the Pacific until the expansion of the Austronesian language speakers through the area around 6000 BP that brought new agricultural and maritime technology. Most of the languages spoken today in the Solomon Islands derive from this area, but some 30 languages of the pre-Austronesian settlers have survived. Initially, this was the period of primitive communism of hunting, gathering, fishing, advanced Paleolithic peoples. These peoples evolved into the agricultural revolution, and as tribal agriculturalists, they evolved into new chiefdoms. In the Solomons, temporal sociocultural evolution was identical with the New Guinea sequence, and for the same reasons as in New Guinea, the simple chiefdoms of the Solomons evolved into advanced theocratic chiefdoms. When the first Europeans arrived, there were remnants of all previous sociocultural stages here and there in the Solomon Islands. There is preserved ATC monumental architecture on New Georgia Island's western province in the Solomon Islands. This includes the AD 1200s megalithic shrine complex, the Nusa Roviana fortress and shrines that date from the AD 1300s through the 1800s, and the Bona Bona Skull Island. This complex of archaeological monuments characterizes fast development of local Roviana culture through trade and headhunting expeditions turning into regional power in the 1600s and 1700s. Nusa Roviana Fortress, shrines, and surrounding villages served as a hub of regional trade networks in the 1600s to the 1800s. The skull shrines of Nusa Roviana are sites of legends ranging from the home of King Kong to the den of infamous pirate gangs. Teola shrine mythology has a legendary stone dog that is said to have turned toward the direction from which enemies of Roviana were coming. Walter and Shepard focused archaeology on the cultural diversity of coastal Melanesia in their work over the last several decades and on the evolution of Melanesian societies. In particular, they focused on the famous Roviana chiefdom, known from the earliest days of European contact as an aggressive head-hunting polity. Rovianders engaged in slave raiding and ritual violence. However, Walter and Shepard also integrated the Solomon Islands into a model of Pacific culture history. Their model includes the Pleistocene, the Holocene spread of original New Guinea invaders, and then the Austronesian and Lapita colonization. We now have an excellent record of sociocultural evolution from the advanced Paleolithic hunter-gatherer-fisher mode of production through the advent of Neolithic agriculture. The emergence of the chiefdom solution to the internal crisis of tribal agriculture occurs in the Solomons. It does so always, as it does always, for the same reasons and in the same way as it had in New Guinea. The chiefdom transition featured new roles for exchange and ecosystems. Until late in the Pleistocene, many of the larger islands of the Solomon Group were joined with Bougainville as a single landmass known as Greater Bougainville. Rising sea levels with the onset of Holocene deglaciation made that land mass into islands. Now, there are the main islands of Bougainville: Villa La Vella, New Georgia, Colombangara, Choiseul, Santa Isabel, Guadalcanal, Malaita, and Makira. All of them are tropical rainforest-clad and mountainous. They have steep central ridges cut by river valleys running onto a narrow coastal belt. Only Guadalcanal and Bougainville have extensive coastal plains. The other islands consist of volcanic and raised reef islands, atolls, cays, or keys, spelled C-A-Y-S, and islets. Now, large areas of inshore lagoon, which are formed by strings of offshore barrier islands, occur along the coasts of some of the large islands, especially Malaita and New Georgia. The islands of the Solomon Group are mainly intervisible and separated by relatively sheltered waters, so canoe travel between islands and island groups has always been comparatively easy. 19th century accounts suggest that canoe trips of over 150 miles were common. The people of the Solomons are diverse in character and language. The most universally recognized cultural distinction is between the saltwater and bush people. Bush people live inland, and their life and traditions center on the forest and gardens, while the saltwater people live on the coast and have a maritime-based lifestyle. Now, as for patterns of culture, the Solomon Islands have considerable linguistic diversity. Between the 70 and 80 languages that are spoken today, most of these are Austronesian languages. Non-Austronesian speakers first settled the Solomon Islands, however. The breakup of the original Solomon's languages occurred in some islands by people carrying Lapita pottery, and it was they who brought Austronesian languages. At the same time, it should not be forgotten that interaction and not isolation is the norm in this part of the Pacific. Archaeological data, contemporary ethnographic oral history, and lexicostatistical data all show this. In fact, for millennia, Solomon Islanders have maintained these complex patterns of interaction. These patterns allow the definition of ethnographic and archaeological culture areas. Thus proven are patterns of distribution of material culture, language, and ATC cult ideology. Solomon's archaeology links Melanesia to the rest of Oceania. From an archaeological perspective, the Solomon Islands occupy a vital position in the culture history of Oceania. The northern Solomons are the eastern limit of known Pleistocene expansion in the Pacific. The eastern Solomons are the boundary of pre-Lapita, that is, mid-Holocene settlement. The Solomons archipelago helps us understand the nature and limits of, first, the pre-Austronesian language speakers' expansion and adaptation; secondly, the origin and spread of Lapita pottery-bearing communities and their interaction with non-Lapita groups; and thirdly, the initial colonization of remote Oceania and the origins of Polynesian society and the evolution of late-period Melanesian diversity. A great deal of archaeology has been done in the Solomon Islands over the last 40 years, and many parts of the record are extremely well covered. There is excellent coverage of Lapita in the regions. In the book, A Review of Solomon Island Archaeology, there is now a substantial body of data on the ceramic record throughout the Solomons, and sequences have been established for the shortlands, parts of the western Solomons, the Reef, Santa Cruz, and some of the Polynesian outliers. The Pleistocene phase of Solomon Island prehistoric archaeology, represented by a single site, Kailu Cave, located in the raised limestone Sohano formations of southeast Buka, and the Pleistocene deposit at Kailu Layer 2 date from 29,000 to 20,000 BP. Now, Kaihu was occupied late in the first pulse of human activity in the region. That first pulse represented the initial colonization of Sahul, S-A-H-U-L, at periods of low sea levels, and the first occupation of New Ireland just before 40,000 BP. The settlement of the Solomon Islands from the Bismarcks involved a sea crossing of 120 miles. These earliest Pleistocene settlers of the Bismarcks were a small, highly mobile group of hunter-gatherers. As settlers moved eastward into the Pacific, they faced a steady decline in both marine and terrestrial biodiversity, and by the time they reached Buka, many of the fauna and flora available in New Ireland were absent from the inventory of potential food sources on Buka. The Pleistocene forests of the Solomon Islands would have been at best marginal for a terrestrial hunting and gathering economy. The picture from Kailu Cave shows a terrestrial vertebrate assemblage from Layer 2 of forest hunting gathering. People ate or otherwise used bats, reptiles, rats, and birds from 6 families, including the Megacode bird, a rail, and several species of pigeons. The marine shell and vertebrate remains reflect an inshore fishing component, and Kailu Cave dates are not particularly early for shell fishing, but the range of vertebrate taxa implies an advanced fishing adaptation. The New Ireland Pleistocene fishbone assemblages have a high relative frequency of benthic feeders from the families Labridae and Serranidae, plus pelagic predators such as the Caragadidae species at Kailu Cave. These families are caught in Oceania using hooks or lures and are significant components of a fishing system based on generalized foraging methods. Thus, the flake stone toolkit from Kailu Cave has provided an excellent model of Pleistocene subsistence in the Pacific. The tools themselves are quite simple and are made of a range of coarse-grained volcanic stones, quartz, calcite, chert, and limestone. Traces of plant residues adhering to some of the flake edges contain starch grains and rhaphides, including starches of Colocasia, Esculenta, and Alocasia species from the earliest levels of Layer 2. Now, use-ware studies suggest that the tools were used for the processing of raw taro corms. At Kailu Cave, the Pleistocene levels show that by 29,000 BP, a set of adaptations had developed that allowed humans to expand into the true oceanic environments of island Melanesia, where the bands of opportunity for non-agriculturalists were even more narrow than in the Bismarcks. The returns for plant gathering in the Pleistocene forests of island Melanesia would have been low. This raises the issue of whether these early settlers were harvesting wild taro or whether they were involved in some form of early plant management activities. Wild stands of Colocasia would have been present in the Buka region when the first settlers arrived. However, domestic taro has larger and more edible corms than the wild varieties, and these only developed as a result of long-term human selection. The amount of residue present on the lower Layer 2 tools is an indication that this selection process had already started by early in the Kailu Cave occupation. Therefore, early survival in the Solomon Islands meant the active management of natural stands of Colocasia and other pre-domesticates. Solomon Island archaeology proves expansion and improvement of optimal growing zones by 1. Removing competitive plant species, and 2. Increasing available light levels through bush clearance around swamps and river edges. This is a form of experimentation and cultivation that leads inevitably to domestication. As such, it shows an autochthonous path of forming the precursors to indigenous Melanesian plant domestication. The question remains as to how far down the Solomon chain Pleistocene settlement advanced, and Kailu Cave was occupied continuously for 10,000 years, so there was clearly no economic barrier to further expansion. Neither was there any significant technological barrier to overcome. The settlers could have traveled as far as southeast as modern Makira without moving far from the coast of the greater Bukita landmass. There is, of course, the site visibility problem, as there would never have been a great number of sites, and in many sites on the coast would have been submerged during the late Pleistocene sea level rises. Now, the most likely place to look for sites of this period is along the raised reef terraces, like those found on the Huon Peninsula and New Ireland, which preserve the earliest record of Pleistocene occupation in Papua New Guinea, or, of course, to engage in marine archaeology. The raised terraces of northeast coastal Rendova have been studied, and excavations in Girhu Mohol rock shelter on the third terrace, and an altitude of 380 feet above sea level, located a water-rolled volcanic cobble at a depth of 1.87 meters in highly degraded limestone clay. As of this writing, datable materials have yet to be recovered from sites along the Rendova Terrace series. Much of the New Georgia group has experienced considerable uplift, and one survey has included rock shelters and upland areas at a variety of heights throughout without prehistoric cultural deposits. Now, the Pleistocene levels at Kailu Cave terminate around 20,000 BP, which coincides with the last glacial maximum that occurs from 22,000 to 20,000 BP. Of course, this was a period of changes in settlement pattern, and this was happening throughout island Melanesia. These changes involved a decline in the movement of people between scarce resources to one in which resources were closer to people. In the Bismarcks, this is marked by the appearance of introduced animal species in the Midden record and an increase in the transport of industrial raw materials, such as New Britain obsidian, from the sources at Thalassia and Mopir. By 20,000 BP, the economies of island Melanesia shifted into a hunting horticulture regime, foreshadowing the emergence in the early Holocene of true agricultural systems. The New Britain obsidians and the introduced animals do not appear until the Lapita period. The appearance of Canarium charcoal at 10,400 BP at Kailu proves contact with the west of the Melanesian islands. Overall, however, the evidence points to the Solomon Islands having been largely isolated from developments in the west during most of the Pleistocene. Coastal movement seems otherwise to have been restricted within the Solomon region, except perhaps within the northern Solomons. Now, as for the early to middle Holocene record, from the end of the last glacial maximum, changes in Solomon Island coastal geomorphology brought about new opportunities for human expansion and exploitation. Sea levels rose with the retreat of the northern ice sheets and reached their highest stands between 5,500 and 6,000 BP. This altithermal was followed by a period of sea level decline, but the specific history of coastal change varied greatly from region to region and resulted from sea level changes and vertical tectonic movement. So two major changes in coastal geomorphology would have impacted human settlement. The first of these was the separation of the Greater Solomon landmass, that is, Greater Bougainville, into a dispersed island chain. This loss of landmass was offset by the creation of hundreds of kilometers of new coastline and coastal reefs, and eventually by extensive coastal lagoon systems. The second was the creation of a sheltered coastal flats that were the main focus of settlement throughout most of the Solomon Islands. Initially, as sea levels rose steadily, the coral reefs struggled to keep pace. Narrow fringing reefs built up from the shore but dropped directly into deep water, offering little protection from the elements. However, through time, coastal benches developed behind sheltered lagoons, and the modern coastal landscape of the Solomon Islands emerged. There is a Netflix series called Chasing Corals, which is worth your while to watch right here because of the light it throws on this change in Solomon Islands coral reefs. The early to mid Holocene has three areas where we can reconstruct a broad outline of events, namely in Buka and the northern Solomons. The earliest Holocene deposits are at Kailu Cave, where Layer 1 expands the period 10,000 to 5,000 BP. Here there is more midden than in the Pleistocene levels, and the density of fireplaces increases, suggesting that the site was more intensively occupied. Flake tools were present in the earliest Holocene levels, but from about 8,000 BP, flake production declines, while groundstone tools, shell tools, and shell ornaments appear. Examples of these new artifact types include an anvil stone, a fragment of Tridacna shell adze, perforated shark teeth and vertebra, and a Terebralia shell chisel or abrader. Direct dating of shell artifacts from the site suggests some intrusion into older levels. Lapita-associated conus pendants are dated here to 7,580 BP. The paleobotanical record proves changes in subsistence. Charcoal remains of coconut, Cocos nucifera, and Canarium indicum and Canarium solomonense have been identified from the early Holocene horizons. Coconut was a natural colonist, Canarium was a human introduction from the New Guinea mainland, and tree cropping started and expanded. The tail end of the Holocene sequence from Kailu overlaps the earliest lenses at Palandraku Cave, located 900 feet to the north, and the pre-ceramic horizons date to about 5,000 BP, where the low amount of cultural material indicates a temporary occupation. The artifact assemblage includes unretouched stone flakes, similar to those found in Kailu Cave, dominated by chert, and with retouched stone flakes, similar to those found in Kailu Cave, dominated by chert, and with some made of quartz, calcite, and fine-grained volcanic stone. The fossil remains point to a continuation in the hunting of small forest game, including the use of endemic reptiles, bats, and rats. An earth oven was found in the pre-ceramic levels. Phalangia orientalis, the human-introduced rat species, and fossil domesticates do not appear until the later Lapita horizons. There are no known early to middle Holocene archaeological sites in the western Solomon Islands as of this writing. However, in New Georgia and the western Solomons, and particularly in the New Georgia group, there did emerge some of the most extensive lagoon systems in the Solomon Islands. Now, these lagoons typically consist of long, shallow, inshore lagoons lying between a string of barrier islands and a mangrove-lined shoreline. And if you see a good example of this, if you look at that movie Dr. No, when James Bond gets over to one of these islands that has this kind of a barrier island structure. Now, these rich sheltered habitats made their appearance from the early to middle Holocene and would have been attractive to expanding coastal, tribal, and chiefdom populations. The formation history of the lagoon systems of the New Georgia group holds a potential key to understanding Holocene expansion into the Solomon Islands and early adaptation in the region. As part of the 1996 to 2000 New Georgia Archaeological Survey Program, swamp cores were taken from a number of locations in Roviana Lagoon. Accordingly, we have a sequence for coastal change in the Holocene vegetation history of New Georgia. The Roviana Corn program targeted the mangrove shores of the barrier islands, swampy river valleys on the mainland coast, and shallow lake beds on islands and along their edges. During the Pleistocene, at Roviana and Bonavona lagoons, and on the southern side of Rendova Island, there were low-stand coastal plains extending out to meet a narrow fringing reef. These plains were dissected by rivers emptying through the major passages between the barrier islands. By just before 4,500 to 4,000 BP, the plains were flooding to reach a stand slightly higher than at present. After 4,000 BP, sea levels started to fall, at least partly as a result of regional tectonic uplift. This led to the formation of many of the barrier islands in Roviana and Bonavona lagoons. By 2600 BP, the current marine landscape was formed. From 4000 BP, the inshore lagoon systems started to develop behind well-formed barrier islands. Although there is no archaeological evidence of human settlement at this time, these geomorphological changes would have made the coast of New Georgia increasingly attractive to human colonists. And this situation for Roviana is likely to have been mirrored in the other lagoon systems of the western province, and perhaps also in Malaita. At Guadalcanal and the Central Solomons, the longest continuous archaeological sequence reported so far from the Solomon Islands is east of Buca at Guadalcanal. The data is important because the first phase of Dr. Rowe's sequence, that is the Hoana phase, is based on an analysis of the only known material of Middle Holocene age east of Buca. It also provides a record of cultural and environmental interactions just before the arrival of Austronesians, and the Guadalcanal sequence is based on excavations of cave and rock shelter deposits in the Poja and Vura valleys and on an open-air site in the Visali area of northwest Guadalcanal. It also draws on paleo-environmental data, especially paleontological evidence. The earliest cultural horizons are from the Vatuluma Posovi sites, also called Poja Cave or Fotoruma Cave, located about 2 miles inland in the Poja Valley. There are 3,000 BP dates from the basal deposits, and Rowe returned to the site in 1986-88 and succeeded in locating a small remnant portion of a cultural deposit near the front of the cave. Rowe constructed from that 5 occupation phases. Phase 1 spans the period 6,500 to 4,000 BP. His Middle Holocene phase is defined by 2 dates that bracket a deposit containing small quantities of artifacts, chert flakes, and chips, and a single trochus armband fragment and trochus fish hook blanks, and quantities of terrestrial animals and marine fish and shell midden of predominantly freshwater species. These artifacts are more closely associated with the stratigraphically higher sample of 4,500 BP. And no artifacts or other cultural material was recovered from level 3, which is dated at 6,200 BP. Now, from further up the Poja Valley, the Vatuluma Tavaro Cave site has produced a sequence that overlaps part of that from Vatuluma Posovi Phase 1, dated to around 4,200 BP, and it includes a single trochus arm ring and an assemblage of shirt ships and flakes. Rowe described this settlement, or the settlement and subsistence practices of this Hoana phase, as representing the exploitation of relatively undisturbed and undeveloped forest and the collection of molluscan foods from fresh and brackish water environments. The faunal assemblages includes endemic rats and reptiles, and together with the molluscan faunas, indicates forest edge and riverine hunting and gathering. Canarium nuts were harvested, but nut processing stones have not yet been identified. The artifact assemblage from the Hoana phase includes chert flakes, trochus shell arm rings, and a few shell fishhook blanks. These occur from the earliest levels, while polished stone adzes and shell beads appear sometime around 3000 BP. Much of the archaeology of island Melanesia is concerned with the arrival and spread of Austronesian-speaking peoples, especially the Lapita pottery, carrying peoples who had both the sailing technology and economic strategies to settle the remote and relatively unpopulated islands of remote Oceania. Lapita makes its first appearance in the west, in the Bismarck Archipelago, about 3400 BP. In Bucca and the northern Solomons, the archaeological record records no further evidence of occupation until the appearance of a late Lapita tradition in about 2700 BP. Rose Hoana phase from Guadalcanal does indicate occupation of the Poha Valley during the period when Lapita was appearing in New Britain, and these sites show no evidence of ceramics or any connection with the arrival of Austronesians. The earliest record for the appearance of Lapita ceramics in the Solomon Islands is in the Reef Santa Cruz Islands of the southeast Solomons. The northern Solomons have long been known to have a long ceramic sequence, and during the historic period pottery manufacture was important in each of the islands or island groups. This region has also benefited from considerable systematic research. Irwin described a ceramic sequence extending back some 1100 years from survey and excavation in the Shortland Islands. Terrell conducted a major research program on Bougainville, recently augmented to provide the first and still the most complete ceramic sequence based on his extensive survey on Bucca. In all these areas, ceramics-bearing sites were commonly found, and in some locations, as on the North Bougainville coast, there are near continuous coastal deposits extending over many miles. In the intertidal zone on Bucas, sites bearing abundant dentate ceramics were found. The three intertidal sites containing dentate lapita ware on Bucca are dated by style seriation to between 3000 to 2800 BP, by finish seriation to around 2300 to 2100 BP, and although dentate stamping seems to virtually disappear on Bucca at one point, many of the characteristics of Lapita ceramic technology and design evolve into the Bucca ceramic style that marks the movement of Lapita settlement onto land. There it appears in a number of sites. The later part dates span 2500 to 2220 BP. This is the late Lapita phase, although he was unable to date it or the start of the Sohano ceramic style that appears to closely follow the Bucca style. No Bucca or late Lapita style ceramic assemblages have been found in the rest of the northern Solomons. More recently, a study in Quieta district south Bougainville produced a 1,500-year sequence at the Saivu rock shelter on the Bougainville Peninsula. At Avo, to the north of Quieta, there is a parallel but shorter sequence. The western Solomon ceramic-bearing sites are everywhere, including eastern Santa Isabel. During the historic period, pottery was manufactured on northwest Choiseul that has close historical and cultural connections with the Shortland Islands and southern Bougainville. Both these regions also practiced ceramic manufacture, and many of the ceramic sites reported in the Western Solomons are intertidal sites that include those few that have included a small number of dentate stamped ceramics. In his early survey work in the Solomon Islands, Chikamori reported ceramics on Choiseul, and Yin later reported sherds on Kolomangara. Ceramic finds spots are reported on Simbo, Kolomangara, and Choiseul, including Vagana Island off Choiseul's eastern tip. There are intertidal ceramic sites on Villa La Vella and New Georgia, including in North New Georgia. The most common decorative technique reported was shallow incising through applique, punctuation, and notched rims. The Bougainville site located in Roviana Lagoon in New Georgia has an assemblage that did not contain any dentate stamped sherds, but did include incised, pinched, fingernail impressed, punctuate, and applied relief wares. In addition, tridacna adzes, a cassis chisel, a tridacna arm ring, and a range of conus shell rings and bracelets were also found in the same intertidal zone, as well as a piece of obsidian. The intertidal deposit dated to a late or immediately post-Lapita period 2500 BP. There are now 20 similar sites from Ara Rosa Point in the east to Nusa Roviana at the western edge of the lagoon, and there are similar sites in the intertidal zone in Morovo Lagoon off the Seghi Channel, Chia Morovo Island, and off the northern end of Gaizo Island, where an obsidian flake has been recovered in the northern Bella Labella Irregular region. Similar assemblages from Kola Mangara have recently been reported. Now, Matthew Felgate did an intensive study of the western end of the lagoon. It produced potsherd taxonomy and distribution, demonstrating that these sites are of the early Roviana ceramic period. At this time, there were stilt house settlements, like those reported in Lapita context on Musao. Felgate reported the first dentate stamped ceramics from two sites, Honeabassa and Nusa Roviana in Roviana Lagoon, and then provided a radiocarbon-based chronology for the New Georgia ceramic sequence. Charcoal from within a sherd from Bougainville was dated to 2130 plus or minus 90 BP. An exterior smoke-derived carbon deposit on a sherd from the Hoi site was dated to 2619 plus or minus 45 BP, and the sherds from these sites contain rectilinear, incised, punctuate, and pinch decoration, as well as a variety of lip treatments, including crenulated or horizontally deformed lips. They confirm the late Lapita age of the earliest ceramics from New Georgia, and Felgate's doctoral dissertation reports a shift from complex pot forms in the earlier Honeabassa site to simpler forms and often thinner wares in the post-Lapita sites that date to the middle to late first millennium BC. This suite of ceramic styles and their sequence is found in intertidal sites throughout the western Solomons. The paleoenvironmental record of Roviana indicates a period of vegetation and sedimentary changes starting after 4000 BP. Evidence from pollen cores sampled in Roviana Lagoon suggests a number of periods of burning from about 3750 BP, increases in ferns, and a steady decline in woody vegetation follow them around 3400 BP. Between 3200 and 2750 BP, there are records of further burning and erosion events. In 2600 BP, there is a first appearance of pottery, and the vegetation and sediment data can be said to clearly represent a human-modified landscape. So, in conclusion, the archaeological and paleoenvironmental record shows the establishment of hundreds of miles of sheltered lagoons with abundant and easily won fisheries after 4000 BP. These would have been a major attraction for human settlers. It is very likely that people moved into and through coastal New Georgia and impacting landscapes and vegetation by this time. At 2600 BP, there is archaeological evidence for sustained occupation in the form of ceramics, and at this time there are regional intertidal community and settlement patterns based on stilt houses, and vegetation changes of clear anthropogenic origin are recorded. The intertidal ceramic sites are the beginning of the continuous occupation record for Roviana Lagoon. They are associated with a settlement pattern similar to that noted in various locations in the Bismarck Archipelago during the late Lapita period in the Western Solomons. This pattern was associated with a late Lapita settlement that occurred after the loss of the dentate stamped ceramics tradition. The Central and Eastern Solomons, the most striking characteristics of the Lapita period is the lack of decorated Lapita pottery, dentate stamped or incised, or for that matter, virtually any ceramics of any period. Although archaeological research on Malaita has been limited, many anthropologists have conducted long-term research there, and none have reported finding any ceramics. Compared to the southeast, northern, and western Solomons, where every survey has produced ceramics of some sort, so it is reasonable to conclude that the main Solomons were not part of the initial wave of colonization by bearers of the dentate stamped Lapita tradition. The only ceramics recovered so far from the Central Solomons date to the very end of the Lapita sequence. These are from a number of rock shelters on Santa Ana, including the Ferru II rock shelter, in the middle of that deposit, which contained cultural material to a depth of 216 centimeters. A small sample of planeware was excavated that includes a rim sherd with a serially incised lip. This was dated by associated charcoals to 1275 plus or minus 105 BP. A subsequent reinterpretation of the stratigraphy has divided it into an upper and lower unit divided by sterile sand. Dates from the hearth in the base of the deposit indicate the pottery-bearing layer was created during the first millennium BC. Green recovered additional sherds from Ferru II, and Davenport reported a rim sherd, undecorated and missing the lip, from the Rate site, located in a shallow rock shelter some 2.5 miles along the shore from Ferru II. This sherd was recovered from a depth of 106 centimeters, where a charcoal date from 85 centimeters suggests it might also date to the first millennium BC. In total, about 20 small plain sherds have been recovered from these sites. And that brings us to a conclusion of our first lecture on the Solomon Islands, and we will continue with one more lecture on the Solomon Islands and the advanced Theocratic chiefdom stage there and the first primitive kingdoms.